Chapter 54, The Breaking Point, Antony's POV. Antony knew that he was making Hanyu uneasy, but he couldn't worry overmuch about that through his sense of calm. His skin tingled, not unpleasantly, and the world felt slow around him. He was glad that the feeling had survived his few hours of sleep. With luck, it would last a while longer. He'd never been able to control its coming and going, but sometimes he was able to hold on to this sense of floating in unreality for weeks at a time. If he had his way, it would last forever. He fixed his braid, careful to avoid the already scabbed patch of scalp where Marcus had ripped out a handful of his hair. In a few days, the hair would be back, the dozens of slices in his flesh would be closed and smooth, the bruises would be gone, and there'd be no evidence that any of it had ever happened. That was how it was with everything. Haircuts, tattoos, injuries, lovers, none of them made a lasting mark since the night of the curse. Valerius was cut into every inch of Antony's body, from the little ring callus that would never soften to the dozens of scars mangling his torso. But Sana, there wasn't a trace of them, and soon there'd be no trace of Marcus either. When Antony was floating like this, he could think those sort of things without losing himself. Everything was better when nothing was real. He found Hanyu picking at his breakfast and didn't bother scolding the boy to eat more as he usually would have done. He just sat patiently until Hanyu pushed his half-eaten meal away and spoke, his voice thick with tears. "Who did you drink from?" "Nobody." Antony was a little confused, but that was all right. "Please, my lord, I saw the blood on the cot," Hanyu said around a sob. "I know it isn't my place to object, and I didn't deserve to serve you after what I did, but—" Antony waited for the rest of what the boy had to say, but instead he just sniffled miserably and fell silent. After a moment, Antony decided that Hanyu wasn't going to elaborate further. "I didn't drink from anyone," he said. "That's the truth. I just hurt myself. Clumsy of me. But a little blood from you will set me to rights. Are you ready to go now?" Hanyu was quiet on the walk. Unusual as it was, his silence suited Antony fine. Bunta's scowl and Kenta's obvious nervousness as they looked up from their own breakfasts couldn't touch him today. He greeted Theo genially as she rose to receive them, though he observed that she didn't look very good at all. He inquired politely after Chihiro, and Theodora's eyes filled with tears. "He's still sleeping most of the time," she said, gesturing to the man, who was indeed sleeping. "I don't think it'll be... Well, were you here to read?" Antony saw the moment her gaze turned sharp as it raked over him. Yes, his gait was a little off, but what was there to catch her eye when he was standing still? "I hope to eat," he said, hoping the interruption would throw her off. "Is that agreeable?" Her face twisted like she was a human biting a slice of lemon. "Could you at least try not to have so much moaning this time?" "Sorry, my lord," Hanyu squeaked. Clearly, he had not lost any of his awe of Theodora, no matter how haggard and despairing she looked. With any luck, that dread would keep the boy's noises in check. Theodora's hand gripped Antony's shoulder, and that was fine, even though her fingers were digging into one of the knife cuts. Antony had been a little worried that the sight of Hanyu's bared throat would be enticing enough to shake him from his blessed sense of unreality, but it did not. What ruined everything was the taste. Hanyu's blood filled his mouth, warm and wonderful as ever, but it was subtly different this time. There was a bitter note that had never been among the flavors before. Antony had been able to stay dispassionate as he saw and heard that Hanyu was frightened by his demeanor, but when he tasted the boy's fear, it brought the world screaming back upon him in all its terrible reality. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're kind and good, and I never meant—" He wrapped his arms around Hanyu's solid body, ignoring the pain as his movements pulled at all his wounds. "Antony?" Theo's voice was hesitant. It's all right, my lord," Hanyu said. "He's not drinking any more." It was true. Antony had swallowed his first mouthful, but he couldn't bring himself to take another. He didn't deserve Hanyu's blood. He didn't deserve Hanyu in any respect. "Why are you still here?" he choked, his face still buried against his offering's neck. "You know what I did!" There was no reply, and he could feel Hanyu and Theo exchanging startled looks over his head. He knew he should be embarrassed, but a dozen overwhelming feelings were crashing in on him at once, and he didn't have space for something as minor as worrying about his dignity. "All right!" Theo, still standing over them, spoke loudly enough that Antony's head snapped up so that he could see her face. "I'm sorry I said anything about the moaning. It was much better than whatever this is. Are you all right?" Antony was still gathering himself. He couldn't quite find the words to answer her, and after a moment she spoke again, her voice a little frantic. "Antony, please, I'm not good at figuring these things out if you won't tell me. Are you all right?" She didn't get her answer because a feeble voice from the bed quivered out, "Theo?" Theodora was kneeling by Chihiro's bedside in an instant, clasping his hand as she gazed up at him. "Chihiro, you're awake!" The old man's face was so sad and tender as he looked at her that Antony forgot his own whirling confusion for the moment and dropped his gaze, feeling like an intruder. "Yes, I am, sweet Theo," Chihiro said softly, then looked over at Hanyu. "You're the young man who reads so nicely, aren't you? Here to read to me? I'd like you to give us the room for a little while." "We'll just come back later," Antony said, though he hadn't been addressed. Good to see you both. Thank you for your help, Theo." Antony followed Hanyu out the door, grateful to leave Theodora and Chihiro to their moment of clarity. He needed to think about other things. "Did you get enough to drink?" Hanyu asked timidly once they were back in their own rooms. "Of course I did." He hadn't, not really. Not enough to replace the blood Marcus had spilled last night, but the thought of taking another mouthful of Hanyu's blood to fuel his own wicked, undeserving existence was repugnant. Theo had loved Chihiro for years and treated him so well that he would look at her like that. She had earned the right to drink his blood. Antony, in comparison, was nothing but a parasite. Eiji and Zenji and all of them had deserved better than him. Valerius and Sana had certainly deserved better. And Hanyu, cheery, sweet-natured Hanyu, whose outburst yesterday was the worst thing he'd ever done, Hanyu deserved... As soon as the thought occurred to Antony, he was astonished by how simple and perfect it was. Why hadn't it come to him sooner? Fuck, he was thick. He needed to broach the topic carefully. He crossed to sit on the couch and pat the cushion next to him. Obediently, Hanyu sat beside him. The boy was bouncing his knee nervously. Antony needed to settle him down, or he would take the suggestion all wrong. He considered pasting on a smile, but Hanyu knew him better than that. He let his face fall into a scowl instead, and that seemed to do the trick. The boy relaxed against him, tucking his feet up on the sofa and leaning over at the ridiculous angle required to rest his head on Antony's shoulder. "You like it at Theo's, don't you?" Antony asked, trying not to notice how good the trusting weight felt. Hanyu nodded vigorously, battering Antony's ear with the top of his head. "Oh, yes. Everyone's a little sad right now, of course, but I think it's usually an awfully cheerful place. Kenta loves it. It reminds me of the temple dormitories, only much nicer." "Theo's an improvement over the priests?" Another nod. "I loved Father Shu and some of the others, but Kenta was telling me about how Lord Theodora brings them books and finds teachers so they can study whatever they want, not just because it's pleasing or anything, but just because they like it." Oh, that did sound nice. And what had Antony done? Pushed the boy into playing music after he had said he had no gift for it, and dragged him around making him read because it was what Antony liked him to do. What if Hanyu wanted to learn about surgery or pottery or fishing? Come to think of it, he'd mentioned several times that he would be interested to have Thad teach him about fish, and Antony had never done anything to ensure that his wish was fulfilled. Well, that was just further evidence that this was a good idea. "You said you'd like to study fish with Thaddeus," he ventured, and Hanyu seized onto that idea at once. "Oh, yes, I love animals. Back at the temple, there were lots of birds and lizards, and cats to keep the mice away, and so many mice that the cats mostly left the birds and lizards alone. And sometimes Father Shu would let me pet his camel. She was old and very grand, and he named her Ami after his great aunt who he didn't like." It was so tempting to let himself be swept away by all the happy chatter and forget his plans, but Antony couldn't let himself be seduced. He tried to keep his voice gentle as he steered the conversation back on course. "So fish are a natural next step from camels? Well, Thad would be delighted to teach you. You liked his rooms, didn't you?" Hanyu shrugged. "I didn't notice much about them. Lord Thaddeus was very kind, though." "And Felix? Do you like Felix?" "I haven't met Lord Felix," Hanyu replied. "Everyone seems awfully fond of him, though. I think he's been good to Eiji." Damn, if the boy had met Felix, no doubt this would be an easier idea to sell. Humans seemed to swoon over him at first sight. Even so. He drew a deep breath, steeled himself, and simply blurted it out. What would you think about going to live with one of them? Hanyu reeled back on the couch and gaped down at him, his brown eyes wide and shocked. What? You could go live with Theo if there's room with her. You'd get to be with Kenta. Wouldn't that be nice? Or Felix, if you meet him and like him, which everyone does. Or you could live with Iovita. They're funny. You'd love them. Or Thad. You like Thad, don't you? Hanyu's face was already pale from Antony's feeding, but it whitened another shade under the golden tan of his skin. Please, the boy whispered, his eyes beginning to fill. Don't send me away, please. Antony needed to make him understand. I'm not sending you away. I'm just suggesting some other options. Better options. They're not like me. They're good. You deserve to be with someone good, Hanyu. I want to be yours, Hanyu insisted. Please don't get rid of me. I'll do better. I'll never say something so awful again, I swear. Antony already regretted his impulsive declarations. Hanyu hadn't had time to get to know Felix or Iovita, or even Thaddeus, really. Of course he would be frightened at the thought of being given to a stranger. What Antony should have done was to keep the idea to himself for the moment and start inviting them all over to let Hanyu get to know them. Cloelia too, and perhaps Anissa. Then, once Hanyu knew which of them he wanted, Antony would arrange it all. It wasn't too late, despite the alarming way he'd introduced the idea. He could start inviting visitors right away. They could still... His thoughts were interrupted as Hanyu slipped from the couch and threw himself at Antony's feet. Please keep me! His voice was high with terror and tears. I'm sorry, I'll be good. Antony leaned over and patted his stiff shoulders reassuringly. It's all right. You can stay here as long as you want, but when you find someone else... I don't want someone else, Hanyu wailed. Please, I'll do anything you want. I'll take any other punishment, but please... It's not a punishment. I just think you'd be happier. I wouldn't. I'm happier with you than I've ever been. I just want... You lived in that fucking temple your whole life. You don't know what you want. You deserve better. I don't want better. I want you. It was the first statement either of them had been able to finish in this whole exchange, Antony thought nonsensically. He looked at his offering. Antony couldn't see his face, but Hanyu's whole body was tense and trembling. Was the thought of leaving him truly so terrible? Wouldn't you miss me? Hanyu whispered, and Antony's useless lump of a heart shattered. Oh no. When he managed to force his voice out, it was almost a whimper. I would, very much. He gazed down at Hanyu's broad back and tumble of hair. How had he let this happen again? He'd been so careful for so many years, but there it was. He would miss Hanyu. He didn't dare probe the feeling any further. It was enough to know that he didn't want Hanyu to go, which meant Hanyu needed to go as soon as possible. The only way to save both of them was to find Hanyu a new master, but Antony was incapable of doing that in the face of the boy's objections. In the first place, he couldn't trust this person to someone who would be willing to take him when he cried and begged to stay. In the second place, Antony himself was helpless before Hanyu's tears. He needed to convince Hanyu, make him want to leave. He had to let Hanyu know what he was. Get up, Antony said shakily, wishing his voice still held the calm of the floating, unreal feeling he'd lost so suddenly. Come into the bedroom with me. I'm going to tell you a story.